They cut her out of the will without a word, left her name off the papers, sold her childhood memories, and laughed as if she'd never mattered. But what they didn't know was that their father had left something behind, not money, not land, a box of old tape recordings that revealed everything. In his own voice, on camera, and when she rolled into the room and pressed play, everything stopped. If you've ever been quietly erased, underestimated, or pushed aside by those meant to protect you, this story will stay with you, because what they thought was over was only the beginning. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The chairs had all been arranged in a neat semicircle, dark leather against paneled mahogany walls that smelled faintly of lemon oil and age. The room was quiet, save for the occasional shuffle of a paper or a forced cough to fill the silence. A portrait of some long-dead judge stared down from above the fireplace, his expression unreadable. A crystal decanter of water sat untouched on the credenza. She entered quietly, without announcement. No one rose. Her wheelchair made only the softest of sounds against the polished floor, but it was enough to draw glances. Her brother shifted in his seat. Her sister leaned slightly away, eyes flicking down to her lap and back up again, as if making sure her presence was real. No one had expected her to come. No one had invited her. She maneuvered herself to the edge of the circle, but no extra chair had been placed. The receptionist had not brought one. The partners of the law firm hadn't thought to include her. Not really. The attorney sat behind a low, lacquered desk, his rimless glasses perched halfway down his nose. His name was Mr. Kavanaugh, and he'd handled her father's affairs for the past 22 years. He looked at her when she entered, but not long, not with recognition. Just briefly, like someone noticing a stranger who'd accidentally wandered in. "I suppose we're all here," he said, clearing his throat and adjusting a sheaf of papers on the desk. "Let's begin." Her brother crossed one leg over the other and folded his hands. Her sister checked her phone quickly and without apology before setting it face down in her lap. The family friend who'd somehow become the trustee leaned forward, expression neutral. They were all so composed, so efficient. Mr. Kavanaugh's voice was calm and practiced as he read the first paragraphs. Legal language filled the room, each phrase precise, deliberate. The estate was sizable properties in 2 states, a cabin in the Adirondacks investment accounts, the lake house, and the family's longtime home. He began naming beneficiaries: her brother, a third of the estate; her sister, another third. Several smaller amounts went to nieces, nephews, and charities their father had supported in name only. Her name didn't come. She waited every time he paused to turn a page. Her body tensed. Maybe now, she thought. Maybe this is the part he left for me. She remembered how he used to tell her stories at night, how he once said she had her mother's eyes. She remembered his hand holding hers in the hospital after the accident, the apology he never said aloud but wrote in his journals. But page after page passed without mention. "I believe that concludes the reading," Mr. Kavanaugh said at last, his tone light, almost casual, as though they had just wrapped up a corporate memo. The notarized will was signed 10 months prior to Mr. Halpern's death. Witnessed and sealed in accordance with Vermont state law, there was a moment of silence before her sister exhaled audibly. "Well, I suppose that's settled." Her brother reached for the pen on the table. "I'll coordinate with the estate attorney regarding property division. The lake house should go on the market first." It wasn't until Mr. Kavanaugh began to shuffle the papers back into their envelope that he seemed to realize she was still there. "Miss Halpern," he said slowly, using the formal tone he reserved for uncertain legal territory, "you weren't listed as a beneficiary. There's no supplemental codicil on file." She didn't speak. No one said her name aloud, not once during the reading. Not in the document, not even in passing. Her brother finally looked at her. "Dad made his decisions. We all have to live with them." Her hands rested on the arms of her wheelchair, knuckles pale. Her legs, wrapped in a soft blanket, hadn't moved in over 7 years. Her voice, when she finally found it, came out low. "Was there a letter?" she asked. Mr. Kavanaugh blinked. "Excuse me," my father said. "He wrote a letter, said he left something personal, something for me." The lawyer glanced at his assistant, a thin man standing by the door. He shook his head. "Not that we're aware of. All that was filed is what I've just read." She nodded once, then backed her chair away from the semicircle. The sound of the wheels against the floor echoed louder now. No one stopped her. No one followed. Her sister began to speak again before the door even closed. In the hallway, she paused under a sconce with a flickering bulb. She pulled out a folded envelope from her coat pocket. It had been left on her windowsill the day after the funeral, tucked under a ceramic rabbit her father had carved years ago. There was no name on the envelope, no date, just a wax seal with the family's crest. She hadn't opened it yet, not until now. The railing had been loose for months. Everyone knew it. The staircase had a sway to it, a soft give beneath the feet that warned of wood too far gone. Each step creaked a little louder than it should have, but no one fixed it. There had been talk quotes from contractors, a folded brochure left on the kitchen counter. Even a neighbor who offered to help with the boards remained splintered, the nails rusted in place. It was a Saturday morning when she fell. The air had smelled of coffee and lemon polish, the kind her father used on the dining table every weekend. She had just come back from the library, a canvas bag of borrowed books slung over one shoulder, her shoes slightly damp from the lawn. She was humming something gentle and forgettable. She took the steps 2 at a time, like she always did, because her body had never known caution until then. Halfway up, the heel of her left shoe caught the edge of the warped plank. She reached out instinctively, automatically for the railing, but it came loose in her hand. For a second, she was suspended, not falling yet, just hanging in that moment of wrongness, that flicker of understanding that something irreversible had begun. Then the world tilted, and her shoulder hit the banister post. Her back hit the edge of a stair. Her head cracked against the lower landing. Her father was in the kitchen. He came running. His footsteps were louder than hers had been. When he saw her lying there, twisted at the base of the stairs, his mouth opened, but no words came, not right away. She remembers the silence more than the pain. The ambulance took 13 minutes. She was conscious through most of it. The paramedics asked her to move her legs. She couldn't. They didn't say anything, but she saw the look they gave each other over her head. At the hospital, they did scans, whispered outside the curtain. Her mother had been gone 5 years by then, and the only face she saw when they wheeled her into the sterile white room was her father's. He looked older than he had that morning, smaller. He took her hand and said, "You're going to be okay." But the words came late, like a line he'd rehearsed too long and forgotten the timing of. She spent 12 days in the spinal unit. Her father came most mornings, brought coffee in a cup with her name on it, sat by the window and watched the traffic. He wasn't unkind, he wasn't cruel, just quiet. Too quiet. Her brother came once, stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed and asked if she needed anything. When she said she'd like the books she'd left on the stairs, he nodded, but they never arrived. Her sister didn't visit at all, sent flowers, carnations, white and pink. No note. The doctors explained everything. T10 spinal injury, incomplete but severe, permanent mobility loss. They talked about options, modifications, long-term care. Her father listened, nodded, took the pamphlets, but back at the house, the staircase remained untouched. The railing was removed, but never replaced. A new coat of paint was applied to the hallway, as if hiding the scene would erase the truth of it. The betrayal wasn't in the fall. It was in the slow unraveling after. The home was never adapted. No ramps were installed, no shower rails. Her father said he couldn't afford the changes, said insurance covered only part. She believed him at first, until a friend, helping her unpack, found the contractor, quote, buried in a kitchen drawer. Accepted, signed, and dated 3 weeks after her accident. Her father had paid a deposit, then canceled it, chose instead to renovate the living room. New carpet, a large screen television. When she asked him about it, he didn't deny it. He just said, "I didn't think you'd be here that long." That was the first time she understood that love could exist next to abandonment, that someone could look you in the eye and still choose something else. She moved into a small apartment the following year. Subsidized housing, a building with a working elevator, and a narrow balcony that overlooked the street. Her father helped her move in, carried one box, left early. From then on, his calls came less often. His visits were infrequent. On her birthday, he sent a card with his name pre-printed, no message inside. It wasn't until he was dying that he called her again, his voice softer than she remembered. "There's something I meant to tell you," he said, but by then she no longer waited for people to finish their sentences. The photo albums told a different story. Polished smiles at every milestone, birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, with matching sweaters. Her brother's arm slung casually over her shoulder, her sister kneeling beside her wheelchair with a hand placed just right on the armrest. Even her father managed the proper tilt of the chin, the proud expression of a man holding a family together. They were good at it. All of them. The camera caught what it was supposed to. The curated version, the one her sister would post online, with hashtags like #FamilyFirst and #Grateful, it didn't show the sideways glances when she asked to be included in trips. It didn't record the long silences when she voiced an opinion, or the moments when they spoke about her as if she weren't in the room. Her siblings were the kind of people who spoke in public voices even when no one was listening. Her brother, David, was a finance consultant in Boston, wore suits even to casual dinners, and never left his phone face down unless he wanted someone to ask what he was hiding. Her sister Marla taught literature at a private school and quoted authors no one had actually read. They could recite their father's values with impressive precision: hard work, resilience, family loyalty. But when it came time to show it, their affection stopped where inconvenience began. After the accident, they were present for the first few weeks, visibly supportive. David coordinated a GoFundMe campaign. Marla wrote a heartfelt post that garnered hundreds of likes and a handful of donations. They showed up at the hospital wearing solemn expressions, posed beside her bed, asked thoughtful questions about rehab timelines. Then, slowly, they drifted. Calls became brief. Visits were squeezed between meetings and social engagements. Marla once brought her a book of poems she'd assigned to her students, claiming it would be healing. But when asked about her next medical procedure, she blinked and said she hadn't been updated. David dropped off a mobility cushion with the receipt still inside. When she thanked him, he said, "Just trying to do my part," and left before she could respond. It wasn't hatred. That would have been easier to name. It was the quiet distance of people who had already restructured their lives without her. She learned early not to ask too much. When their father downsized into a smaller home, she was offered the downstairs office, not the spare bedroom. They called it better access, though it had no bathroom of its own and barely fit her bed. Marla insisted she decorate it to feel more empowering. David suggested turning the old garage into an independent suite, and then never mentioned it again. She noticed things, like how they'd plan family holidays without asking her schedule, how group texts would go silent the moment she asked logistical questions: how many stairs, how long a drive, whether the restroom was accessible. She watched them talk over her during decisions, thank her for understanding when plans changed last minute. They spoke of her needs with practiced compassion, then stepped away from the responsibility of meeting them. At dinners, she was always seated at the end of the table. Easier for the wheelchair, they'd say, but it also made it easier to forget she was there. Conversation flowed around her, rarely through her. They smiled in photos, clinked glasses, toasted memories she hadn't been invited to make, and yet, when others asked, they painted themselves as devoted. David told friends he'd helped design her apartment. Marla claimed she managed all her prescriptions. Their father praised them often, proud of how the other two had stepped up in the face of tragedy. She said nothing to contradict it, because correcting the lie would have meant setting fire to a house already full of smoke. When the will was read and her name wasn't there, the surprise wasn't theirs. It was hers for believing, even briefly, that beneath the layers of polish and posture, family still meant something. Not the version in framed photos, but the kind that shows up when no one's looking. The kind that stays, that remembers, that doesn't need proof to include you. Kind, she learned, had never been hers. It was raining the day she saw him last. Not a downpour, just a thin, persistent drizzle that left the sky flat and colorless. She had called ahead to make sure someone would be there to help with the front steps. The nurse said she'd leave the side door unlocked instead. No one met her at the curb. No one ever did. The house smelled the same as always: lemon oil and old wool, like furniture that had stopped being used and started being preserved. She made her way down the hall slowly, her wheels catching slightly on the edge of the worn rug. The living room lights were dimmed. A mug of untouched tea sat on the table beside his chair. Its steam long since vanished. He looked smaller than she remembered, not just thinner, but folded inward somehow. The man who had once filled rooms with his voice now sat hunched beneath an Afghan blanket, wrapped in silence. His skin was the color of linen, and his hands trembled when he reached for the remote. He no longer used. He noticed her, but didn't smile, just nodded and gestured to the armchair across from him, as if her wheelchair would fit there. She didn't comment. She was used to the oversight. For a while, they didn't speak. She listened to the sound of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the occasional rattle of the furnace kicking in. His breathing was uneven, but steady. When he finally spoke, his voice was more breath than words. "I had a dream you were walking," he said, not looking at her. She didn't respond. Dreams were easier than facts. In dreams, the staircase never broke. The railing held. The fall never happened. "I thought you might not come," he said after a pause. "You didn't ask me to," she replied. He nodded again, as if that answer was expected. "They told me you'd be angry." She didn't ask who they were. She already knew. Her brother, with his neat reports and logistical advice. Her sister, with her soft voice and hard edges. They had managed his calendar, his care, his narrative. She was the one they mentioned, but rarely included. "I'm not angry," she said. He turned his head toward her. "No, I was, but not anymore." She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "You get tired of waiting for someone to see you the way you need to be seen." He let out a small noise, maybe a laugh, maybe a cough. "I never meant to push you out, but you did." He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just let the silence return. After a while, he reached toward the table beside him and picked up a folded napkin. From beneath it, he pulled out a small envelope, unsealed, yellowed. Her name was written on the front in a handwriting that looked uncertain, like it had been started and stopped multiple times. "I was going to have this added to the will," he said, holding it out. "But your brother said it would delay everything." She didn't take it. Not yet. She needed to hear the rest. "I wrote it after your last birthday," he continued, "when I saw the gift you sent your niece. The hand-sewn quilt squares. The ones you stitched from Mom's old dresses." Her throat tightened. She remembered that gift. It had never been acknowledged. "I realized then," he said slowly, "that you'd never stopped trying to be part of this family. Even when we made it so hard for you." "You didn't stop them," she said. Not accusing, just stating. "No," he agreed. "I didn't." He looked tired, the kind of tired that settled deep into the bones. "But I want you to know, I didn't forget you. I didn't cut you out. I waited too long to fight back." She took the envelope then. It was light, nearly weightless, but it felt heavier than any document she'd ever held. "It's not in the will," he admitted, "but it should have been." She nodded. "I know." As she left the room, the drizzle had started again. She didn't look back. He didn't call her name. That was the last time she saw him sitting small in the chair that used to be too big for anyone else, holding the space he no longer filled, saying too little, too late, but saying it anyway. David stood at the end of the long table like he owned the place. His tie was too tight, knotted with precision that didn't match the room's somber tone. The corner of his mouth curled slightly as he glanced down at the folder he had already opened, even before everyone had settled in. He didn't sit. He wanted to stand, to preside, to signal something. The room was filled with polished furniture and muted tension. The lawyer, Mr. Kavanaugh, occupied the chair at the head of the table. His hands rested flat on the polished surface, one thumb tapping rhythmically against a stack of crisp legal documents. The lamp above him cast a dull yellow light over the entire scene, catching the metal trim of his glasses as he looked toward David without speaking. Marla was seated across from him, her legs crossed, one foot gently bouncing in a way that betrayed her practiced calm. She wore a tasteful dark blouse and pearl earrings, the kind she wore to funerals and board meetings. She didn't look at her sister, not once. Their sister had arrived last. She had positioned herself at the far end, not in a seat there had been no effort made to move one for her, but at a gap in the table's curve where her wheelchair just barely fit. No one had helped her adjust. No one had asked if she could see Dot. David cleared his throat, a theatrical pause that suggested importance. "I know Mr. Kavanaugh usually handles this part," he said, voice warm but calculated. but as the executor. And as Dad's son, I wanted to read this myself. Mr. Kavanaugh didn't object. He looked down, then away, as if this transfer of authority had already been rehearsed behind closed doors. His discomfort was evident in the way his fingers clenched. The pen on the table, then released it. David straightened the folder. Our father, Albert Halpern, having been of sound mind and body, prepared the following last will and testament, dated July 3rd of last year. His voice was measured, professional. He was used to these kinds of rooms. All legal matters were reviewed and finalized with the assistance of Mr. Kavanaugh and filed accordingly. There was no eye contact. He wasn't speaking to the room. He was performing for it. He began with himself. To my son, David Halpern, I leave the lake house, along with all furnishings therein and full ownership of Halpern & Sons storage, including all rights, property, and profits related to said business. He paused, barely hiding the satisfaction in his voice. Marla glanced over, offering a faint smile of approval. To my daughter, Marla Halpern, totaling $140,000. Another pause, shorter this time, to my grandchildren each. Will receive a trust in the amount of fade, continued, but the words started to fade in her ears. They floated above the room like a ceiling fan that had been turned on low. She sat still, not blinking, barely breathing. Her name hadn't come page after page. Instructions, allocations, conditions, but nothing. No mention, not even a passing reference to my third child. Not a word. David turned the last page. And to all other property and personal effects, I instruct the executor to make determinations based on family consensus and best judgment. He looked up then, directly at her. The smile wasn't wide. It wasn't obvious, but it was there settled. At the corners of his mouth, in the glint behind his eyes, Mr. Kavanaugh cleared his throat, as if about to speak, but didn't. His lips pressed together. His gaze dropped to the legal pad in front of him. He didn't look at her either. David closed the folder with a neat finality. That concludes the reading, he said, like a man ending a meeting. We'll proceed with documentation, signatures, and next steps. Silence lingered. No one spoke to her. Not Marla, not Kavanaugh, not David. She moved her chair back slowly, the faint whir of the motor filling the space no one else had the courage to fill with words. Her brother had read the will with confidence, but the room had not been still with peace. It had been heavy. With something else, something quieter, more dangerous. Because what they didn't know, what none of them had asked, was what else her father had said. Not written, but said and recorded. The meeting had ended. At least, that's what David had declared. He stood by the window now, sipping from a glass of water with the calm satisfaction of someone who believed a door had been closed. Marla checked her phone with casual urgency, pretending not to notice her sister still sitting silently at the far end of the room. The air had begun to settle into that awkward hush that follows a dismissal paper shuffled. Chairs scraped against the hardwood, and conversation shifted to logistics, but she didn't move. Not yet. Her hands remained folded in her lap, the skin at her knuckles pale from pressure. She looked at Mr. Kavanaugh, who was quietly tucking the legal documents back into a padded envelope. His eyes avoided hers. There was a letter. She said. David stopped mid-sip the glass, pausing near his mouth. Marla looked up from her screen, brows narrowing. A letter? Mr. Kavanaugh asked, not quite looking at her. My father wrote it in September, she continued. He dictated most of it to his nurse. He wasn't able to write more than a few lines himself, but she signed as witness. He told me he wanted it included, said it would be added to the will. David gave a dry, almost amused exhale. I think you might be misremembering. Dad wasn't exactly lucid after August. We have documentation of that. She kept her eyes on Kavanaugh. He was lucid that day, for hours. Marla leaned forward slightly. Why didn't you mention this sooner? Before the will was read? Because I didn't think it would be missing. Mr. Kavanaugh cleared his throat, his fingers twitching slightly as they hovered over the envelope. If such a letter exists, he began, and it was meant to supplement the will, it should have been brought to my office or filed officially. We have no record of any letter beyond what was notarized. He told me he gave it to David, she said quietly. David laughed. Now, not loudly, but sharp enough to echo. That's absurd. I never saw a letter. I never received one. And I certainly didn't hide anything. She watched him closely, the way his shoulder tensed under his blazer, the faint crease in his brow that didn't match the smile on his face. "He described it to me," she said. Her voice even, he said it had a gold ribbon, that it was folded inside one of Mom's music books, the one with the red spine. He said he didn't trust that the paperwork alone would be enough, that people would need to hear what he meant. Kavanaugh looked mildly uncomfortable now. He adjusted his glasses, eyes flicking between the siblings. "I can check with the nurse," he offered, carefully not committal. "If she has any documentation or notes, perhaps we can confirm that such a letter existed." David stepped in. "Again, let's not start chasing ghosts. Dad was very clear in the version we filed. He had time to change things if he wanted to. He didn't. That's the reality." Marlon nodded. "We can't go rewriting legal documents based on hearsay." "It wasn't hearsay," she replied. "He told me himself. He was scared you'd erase me." David set the glass down with a dull click. "That's enough." Mr. Kavanaugh opened a new file folder slowly, his hand now visibly unsteady. "If it existed," he murmured, more to himself than anyone, "and if it wasn't filed, then legally, it carries limited weight. But ethically, of course, it matters." He trailed off. She didn't press, not yet. She simply stared at the envelope, now resting quietly in the center of the table. Inside it was the formal version of her father's wishes, curated, cleaned, and codified by the people who had controlled the final days of his life. But she had seen him, heard him, and that day on the couch, his voice thin but resolute, had looked her in the eyes and said, "If they don't include this, you show them what I said." Now she just had to find it. Not for the court, not even for herself, but because if the letter was gone, if it had been discarded or hidden, meant someone had made a choice, and choices left fingerprints. She would know where to look. The ramp creaked slightly as she rolled out onto the porch. It was late afternoon, the sky a dull gray that never quite turned into rain, but never gave way to sun either. She moved slowly, not out of caution, but out of something harder to name, something that pulled her down from the inside and made movement feel heavier than usual. At the porch's edge, where the wood slats met the chipped white railing, she stopped. The wheels clicked once as she locked them in place below her. The street was still, the kind of still that only happened in neighborhoods where people worked late or kept their curtains drawn. A few yards away, a wind chime clinked lazily in the breeze. A plastic bag caught in the gutter flapped now and then, but never flew free. The mailbox across the road had a crooked flag no one had bothered to fix. She stared at it all, not looking for anything, just letting the silence settle inside. The house hummed softly, her refrigerator, the old baseboard heater, the distant sound of a neighbor's television through the shared wall. But out here, she could forget all that. Out here, she could be no one, just a body in a chair, a shape against the railing, a presence without expectation. She wasn't crying. That part had passed. There had been a time, years ago, when she would have cried after a day like this, when being erased from a room would have stung loud and raw. But repetition dulls the shock of certain wounds. What today brought wasn't pain, exactly. It was something else, an awareness that came not like a blade, but like water slow soaking, inescapable. She had sat through the reading of her father's will, listened as her name was not said, watched as her brother took control of something that had once belonged to all of them and then redefined the edges to exclude her. She had spoken, asked, offered memory and truth, only to be met with polite dismissal, no shouting, no accusations, just the careful denial of her reality by people who preferred cleaner narratives. The wind picked up for a moment, rustling the leaves that had gathered at the porch's corner. One tumbled forward across the step, then stopped, caught in a crack between boards. She watched it, then turned her gaze toward the streetlight that hadn't flickered on yet. Even though the sky was darkening, it was easier to be out here, where everything made sense, where gravity pulled and wind moved things, and time passed, whether you asked it to or not. She had done everything the right way, played the part they wanted, smiled for pictures, showed up at family dinners, sent thank you cards and holiday gifts. She hadn't asked for more than what was fair, not in years, not even after the fall. But fairness, she'd learned, was often the first thing sacrificed when comfort was on the line. A car passed slowly, an old sedan dented near the bumper. The driver didn't look at her. She didn't look back. There was something comforting in that. The mutual invisibility, the agreement to not ask questions. Somewhere behind her, her phone buzzed. Probably another message from a cousin who'd heard about the will and wanted to check in. More condolences that didn't say anything. More concern that asked for nothing in return. She didn't move. The porch beneath her was uneven. The boards warped just enough that the chair's wheels leaned slightly left. But she was used to compensating. That's what her life had been. In so many ways, adjusting for things that no one else noticed long enough to fix. The street lamp flickered once, then came on. She exhaled slowly, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of holding herself upright in a world that refused to make room. She would sit there a little longer, let the day fall into evening, let the stillness stretch out like a thread. She wasn't waiting for anything, but she wasn't finished either. The nurse came on Thursdays. Not officially, her schedule had shifted months ago, but she still found time, always in the afternoon, always with a quiet knock before entering. Her name was Ruth, and she had been assigned to the rehabilitation ward the year after the accident. Long after the specialists rotated out and the insurance cycles ended, Ruth stayed. She brought tea this time, the good kind, from the small shop near the hospital. Honey ginger, no fanfare, no explanation, just placed it on the table beside the couch and sat without asking. The living room was clean. Always was. The floors were polished wood, the windows spotless. She kept things orderly, not out of pride, but because control, in the end, was often all she had. The walls were lined with framed sketches, her own and the faint scent of eucalyptus. Drifted from the oil diffuser near the window, Ruth sat with her hands folded over one knee. She didn't speak right away. She rarely did. I heard about the will, she said finally, eyes focused on the edge of the table rather than her face. She nodded, not looking up from the envelope she was holding. The same one her father had given her weeks before his death, still sealed. I don't mean to intrude, Ruth added gently, but are you certain this is legal? There was no bitterness in her voice, just the kind of concern that sits low and steady, like a hand hovering just above your shoulder. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the cup of tea and took a slow sip. It was still warm. I've seen a lot of things, Ruth continued, quieter now. Families do strange things when someone dies. People act like grief gives them permission to rewrite history. The words hung there. Still, she didn't respond. Ruth looked over at her, studying her face. You don't have to pretend this doesn't hurt. She exhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but to clear the space between them. I'm not pretending. Then what are you doing? She stared at the seal on the envelope in her hand. Her father's crest, faint from time, but still visible. Waiting for the noise to settle, Ruth leaned back in the chair. The cushion sighed under her weight. You know, your father asked me to witness something a few weeks before he passed. A letter said it was important. Her fingers tightened around the envelope. Did you see where he put it? No, Ruth said. He folded it carefully and said he'd take care of it. I assumed it would be added to the legal paperwork. It wasn't my place to ask. Silence again. Not cold, but tired. He told me they might try to erase me, she said finally. Ruth's lips pressed into a line. They're not even hiding it. She nodded. They never really did. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Outside, a bird landed briefly on the railing, then took off again without a sound. I want to believe there's a line people won't cross, Ruth said, but every year I get a little less certain. I used to think love would stop them, she replied, or at least decency. Ruth didn't try to contradict her. They sat in that space together, not trying to fix anything, just existing in the quiet aftermath of a truth too plain to dress up. When Ruth stood to leave, she placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Let me know if you need help. She nodded again, but didn't turn her head. After the door closed, she remained still. The tea had cooled, the light in the room had softened. The envelope in her lap felt heavier now, like it had absorbed the weight of what hadn't been said aloud. Are you sure this is legal? Ruth had asked. Maybe not. But the silence around it, the silence of those who knew better and chose convenience, that was louder than any lie, louder than betrayal, louder than theft. It was the kind of silence that built empires on the backs of people no one remembered. The kind that smiled in photos, made toasts, and slept soundly. She wouldn't scream, but she wouldn't stay silent either. The estate sale was set for Saturday morning. Rain was forecast, but that didn't stop them. A white tent was erected in the circular driveway, and folding tables lined the perimeter. Sagging under the weight of items that used to mean something, small tags were tied to everything red ink, neat handwriting, prices circled for convenience. She came early, not because she was invited, but because no one thought to stop her. She stayed in her car across the street, the engine off, windows cracked just enough to let in the sound of casual conversation. The sale didn't begin for another 30 minutes, but the first few cars had already pulled up. Neighbors, curious, passersby, strangers looking for bargains. David stood near the porch, clipboard in hand, dressed like a man hosting a charity auction instead of liquidating their parents' life. Marla flitted between tables, her voice pitched a little too high, her hands too animated. She greeted people with the cheer of someone doing something responsible, mature, necessary. They didn't see her. They never really did. From the car, she could make out each item as it was laid out. Her mother's porcelain figurines, up in a perfect row, their delicate hands chipped from time. A stained glass lamp that once sat on the piano bench. A box of her father's vinyl records, alphabetized and cracked along the edges. None of them had been dusted, just pulled from shelves and boxed up like donations. She saw the music box next, oval-shaped, painted with violets. Her mother used to wind it each night while she folded laundry. The melody was faint even then. Now it sat at the edge of a table, the lid open like a mouth trying to remember a tune it no longer knew. Next to it, a framed drawing. Her drawing, age 6, crayons. Too much red. A crooked house with a chimney that spewed hearts instead of smoke. Her father had kept it above his desk for years. He said it reminded him to come home before dark. Now it had a sticker on the corner, $5. She watched as a woman in a long coat picked it up, turned it in her hands, and set it back down. The gesture was casual, unconscious, but something in her stomach twisted all the same dot. Another table held her mother's scarves. Silk. Some still smelled faintly of jasmine. Marla folded one and handed it to a woman with a $20 bill already in hand. The exchange happened without a pause, without a story, just a transaction. At the far end of the driveway, David directed a pair of movers toward the upright piano. He tapped the wood and said something she couldn't hear. One of the men lifted the bench and peeked inside. The hymnals were still there, her mother's annotations blue ink, looping cursive, marked every third line with harmony notes. None of that was mentioned. Just measurements, delivery instructions. A teenager walked past with a shoebox full of cassette tapes, her father's old mixtapes. For the road, one was labeled another, simply said, 1979. She wanted to stop him, ask him if he even owned a tape player, but he didn't know who she was, and he wouldn't have cared. No one asked where she was, no one said her name. The sun emerged briefly, casting a warm light across the tent, and someone laughed near the front steps. It was Marla, laughing at something David had said. Probably about parking or pricing or who still used a record player. It didn't matter. She sat in the car for over an hour, watched pieces of her life exchanged for bills and coins, watched the careful dismantling of a home dressed up as efficiency, watched strangers carry away what no longer fit into the lives of those who once claimed it. When she finally turned the key in the ignition, she didn't drive away immediately. She sat for a while longer, the engine humming beneath her. Her hands rested still on the steering wheel, but her eyes stayed on the tent. There had been no announcement, no notice, just a quiet erasure. And yet, not everything had been sold. Not yet. Some things she knew couldn't be Bator buried. Not while she still remembered. Not while she still had the letter. Not while her name still echoed in the walls of the house. No one saw her leave. The attic was hotter than the rest of the house. The narrow pull-down stairs creaked under her weight as she inched upward, the chair waiting at the base, like a sentry she'd soon return to. She didn't go up there often anymore. The last time had been before the accident, before the years began carving distance into every corner of her family's life. But something had pulled her back. Not urgency exactly, but instinct, like a thread tugging gently, somewhere beneath grief. The air smelled of old insulation and cedar. Dust floated thick in the sunlight that filtered through the small square. Window at the gable. Piles of boxes leaned against each other like tired bodies. Most were labeled in David's tidy handwriting: Christmas books, kitchen mom donation. The labeling had come after their father's funeral, when David took charge of cataloging every shelf, every drawer, every room. Efficiency had always been his language of mourning. She moved slowly, careful not to knock anything over, her fingers brushing along the cardboard edges, looking for nothing in particular. She passed boxes of photo albums, rusted holiday tins, and water-damaged binders filled with old report cards. Then, in the corner beneath the old rocking horse, she saw it. A shallow white box, no tape sealing it, just dust. The top sagged slightly from years of storage. She lifted the lid. Inside were MiniDV tapes, dozens of them, some labeled by year 1996, 1998, 2002. Others were more specific. Cedars First, Steps, Anniversary Lake House, Thanksgiving 2005, and then a cluster of them toward the bottom, bound together with a rubber band that had long since cracked and split. These were different, Dad Private. They read, some were labeled only with single words: trust, letter, library. A few had no label at all. Her breath caught. These weren't the family videos they used to watch in the den on winter nights. These weren't for company or nostalgia. These were set aside, tucked away, and forgotten, or hidden. She stared at the tapes in her lap, suddenly aware of how quiet the attic had become. No creaks, no wind, just the faint hum of old wiring in the walls. Her father had owned a small digital camcorder, the kind with a fold-out screen and tiny tape cassettes that clicked into place with mechanical certainty. He'd used it obsessively when they were younger. Birthdays, school plays, even the mundane moments like reading by the fire or making pancakes on Saturdays. But after her mother died, he'd filmed less. After her accident, almost nothing. She didn't remember him recording anything marked private. Gently, she gathered the tapes into the box again, one by one, her hands steady, but her heart beginning to race. These weren't the kind of things you labeled for fun, not the kind of things you left for just anyone. The word trust echoed. Was it a message, a warning, an attempt to set something right? She didn't know, but she knew one thing. Whatever was on them, David hadn't found them. If he had, they would have disappeared. No tags, no sale, no mention. They would have been erased the way her name had been. Back downstairs, she placed the box carefully on her lap, her chair whirred to life beneath her. She rolled past the kitchen where her childhood artwork had once hung, past the den where they used to watch family videos on a grainy screen, past the framed family photo in the hall where she had been, cropped at the edge without anyone ever admitting it. She drove straight to the apartment. The camcorder was still in the closet, tucked beside a basket of sewing materials and a stack of books she'd meant to read. It took a moment to find the right charger. The tapes sat beside it on the table, waiting. She didn't press play yet. Needed quiet, she needed time. But already, something was shifting. Her father had erased her from the will, or someone had. But this box in her lap was the first sign he might have tried, in the only way he could, to undo what had been done in his name. The camcorder was heavier than she remembered. A smooth, boxy weight in her hands that reminded her of another time before the accident, before the silence, when her father used to film Christmas mornings with the kind of reverence other families reserved for prayer. She hadn't touched the device in years, but it still smelled faintly of old batteries and dust. Like a drawer left unopened too long. It took 3 tries to get it working. The screen flickered once, then again, before stabilizing into a dull blue glow. She inserted the first tape slowly, careful not to force it. The mechanism clicked into place with a familiar whir, a sound she hadn't heard since she still believed that love and proof were the same thing. The label on the tape read only Library, 2009. When the screen came to life, it was with a quiet jolt. The picture was grainy, slightly off-center, and unsteady. Her father sat alone in the library's chair by the window, the heavy bookshelves behind him casting long shadows. He wasn't looking at the lens, not yet. He fiddled, with the cuff of his shirt, his watch glinting once in the lamplight. Then he exhaled slowly and looked straight ahead. "If you're watching this," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered, "then something's gone wrong." She didn't breathe. "I don't know what version of me you're being told about," he continued. "And I don't know who's controlling the story now, but this is mine. This part, at least, is mine." The camera adjusted slightly, the image sharpening just enough to make out the lines in his face lines deeper than they'd been in her memories, heavier than any photo had captured. His eyes looked tired, but not unkind. There was a sadness in them that startled her, because it was the kind that knew itself well. "I've made mistakes," he said. "Big ones, and some small ones that felt big later." He paused, swallowing hard. "Not writing you into the new will. That was one of them, a deliberate one, and I'm not proud of it." She didn't know how long she'd been holding her breath. She let it go all at once, a sharp exhale that startled even her. "They told me it would be cleaner," he said, "that it would keep things from getting complicated, that you'd be taken care of in other ways, that a trust would be better quiet, private, not part of the will, but that never happened, because I didn't push hard enough." He looked down, then back up. His voice grew softer, but not weaker. "I should have insisted. I should have demanded they include you, but I didn't. I let them tell me what made sense on paper, and I forgot what was real." There was a long silence. He shifted in his chair, looked away for a moment. Then he spoke again. "You were never a burden. Not once. They said you needed too much, that you took too much space, too much time. But what they didn't understand is what you gave back was more than any of us could carry. You were the one who stayed kind, even after the fall. Even after I stopped showing up the way I should have." She pressed her hand to her mouth. No tears yet, just heat behind her eyes, pressure behind her ribs. "I recorded this in case they tried to erase you," he said, voice steadying again. "In case my silence left you with nothing but doubt. You deserve more than what I gave. You always did." He leaned closer to the camera now, as if trying to close the space between them. "I don't know who you'll be when you see this, but I hope you'll remember who you were before they told you otherwise, and I hope this proves that I saw you. I did, even when I didn't say it, even when I should have said it more." The screen went black. She sat there, motionless, the camcorder still warm in her hands. The room was quiet, but something inside her was loud. Not grief, not rage, just something rising, something old, like recognition. He had spoken into silence, and now silence was no longer an option. The second tape was labeled simply, "Trust, Final." She waited until the light outside had dimmed into that soft, in-between gray of early evening. She didn't want distraction. The camcorder sat ready on the desk, its screen already unfolded. The first tape had left her shaken but clear. This one felt heavier, like a sealed door being cracked open. She inserted the tape and pressed play. The picture flickered before settling. Her father was seated in the same chair, wearing the same gray sweater as before, but his posture was different now, more formal, like someone recording a will of his own making. Papers sat in his lap. He didn't look at the camera right away. "Recording this," he said slowly, "because some things don't belong on paper." His eyes lifted then, direct, serious, the voice she remembered from childhood, firm, methodical, was back. "This is for Cedar," he continued, "and only for her. If someone else is watching this, then you've already done something you shouldn't." She sat perfectly still. "I've left instructions that were supposed to be followed," he said, "about the lake house, about the library collection, about the artwork in the attic, and about the trust accountant, the name J.E. Holding. That's hers, no one else's, not David, not Marla. It's in a sealed account, and only she has the authorization code." He reached to the side, lifted a small notebook. She recognized it immediately. It used to sit in the drawer beside his bed. He opened it to a page, stared down for a moment, then continued. She was promised those things because they belonged to her, not just legally, morally. They were things her mother wanted her to have. The music box, the pendant, the first editions in the cedar chest. None of it was to be sold. His mouth tensed, that it wasn't notarized. "But they also know I told them. I told them more than once. I wrote it in my own hand. I said it in front of the lawyer." He paused again, took a slow breath. "If this video's being watched, then that means something went wrong. That someone chose to forget or to rewrite. And if that's the case, then they've already tried to erase her." She leaned forward, slightly, not out of suspense, but out of something deeper, confirmation. "She's not weak," he said then, his voice lowering. "Don't mistake her quiet for surrender. She's watching, and if I know her, she's remembering everything. He picked up a folded piece of paper. The camera zoomed slightly, the text unreadable but distinct. This is a list of items. They'll claim were never mentioned. This copy is sealed in the false bottom of the oak drawer third desk on the left in the study. The one with the sticking hinge. If it's not there, it was taken. And if it was taken, it means someone knew. What they were doing? His eyes flicked toward the lens, cold now focused. To whoever tries to deny this, don't. You won't win. You may own the paperwork, but the truth outlasts signatures, especially when it's recorded. He folded the paper again, tucked it out of sight, and sat back. His shoulders sagged a little then. The fire behind his words softened, and the man she remembered returned. This was supposed to be simple, he said, barely above a whisper. She wasn't supposed to be alone. The screen went black. She didn't move for a long time. The camcorder word, signaling the tape's end. Her hands rested in her lap, her breath steady but deep. He had promised her things. Not grand inheritances, not extravagance. Just memory, truth, protection. Now she had his words, and soon they would have to hear them too. The driveway hadn't changed. Gravel scattered along the edges, the same crack down the center where the frost always pushed through each winter. The old magnolia tree still leaned slightly toward the house, its limbs low with the weight of late-season blossoms. She hadn't been there since the estate sale, since the music box, the piano, her childhood drawing all sold to strangers, while her name was omitted from memory. But now she was back. No one saw her arrive. The ramp she used to struggle up was gone. David had it removed when the porch was renovated. She didn't bother with it. She came through the side entrance instead, the one by the old pantry window. It was unlocked. Voices drifted in from the dining room. Marla, David, and a few cousins all gathered around the long table. A tray of drinks sat in the center. There was laughter, something about vacation plans, a cousin's new promotion. No one said her name, no one expected her. She moved down the hallway slowly, letting the wheels hum across the hardwood floor. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and something roasted. She passed the study empty nound, the stairwell where she'd once fallen. Her eyes didn't linger. She entered the dining room without a word. The room fell silent. David was the first to speak. "What are you?" She held up one hand, not for silence, just enough to pause the room. She said nothing. No announcement, no demand. Her presence alone felt louder than anything she could have said. From her bag she pulled the camcorder, black, worn, and an untouched napkin folded into a fan. She opened the screen, adjusted the angle, pressed play. Her father's face filled the screen, grainy but unmistakable. His voice, steady and calm, poured out across the room like something sacred. "Recording this because some things don't belong on paper," he said. "This is for Cedar, and only for her." The silence in the room thickened. No one reached for a drink now. Marla shifted in her seat. Her eyes darted toward David, but he said nothing. The cousins glanced between them, unsure whether to keep watching or look away. About the lake house, about the trust, about the artwork in the attic. Her father continued. She was promised those things. The tape played on. Her father listed items, mentioned the account, the instructions. His face never wavered. His voice never cracked. The truth had been sealed, and now it filled the room without permission. When the word erased was spoken soft but deliberate, something in Marla's expression changed. Her eyes narrowed, her mouth tight, but she didn't speak. David sat straighter, like a man recalculating, weighing options in real time. No one interrupted. The camcorder played the full message. Every pause, every confession, every correction of the story they thought they had secured. It ended in silence, the screen fading to black dots still. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The weight of her father's words hung in the room, pressing into the spaces between the wine glasses and polished forks, settling deep in the air they now had to breathe. It was no longer about sentiment. It was evidence, undeniable, unscripted, unplanned. She met David's eyes, then Marla's, then turned. No announcement, no farewell, just the soft click of her wheels on the floor as she moved down the hallway again. Behind her, chairs remained still. Voices stayed quiet. The screen of the camcorder remained open, flickering faintly on the table as if daring someone to rewind it. She didn't look back. She didn't need their validation. Not now. She had brought the truth into the room, and it would never leave. The moment the tape began, it was as if the entire house forgot how to breathe. Forks hovered mid-air. A glass clinked softly as someone set it down too quickly. The room, which just seconds before had been filled with the warm hum of casual conversation, vacation stories, shallow jokes, the kind of comfort that comes from shared exclusion, now fell under a different light. Her father's voice cut through it all. They hadn't heard it in person in over a year. Not since the funeral, where his eulogy was read by someone else and his silence was reimagined as quiet dignity. But the voice on the tape was unmistakable. Slow, intentional, clearer than memory allowed. "I made promises," it said, "and I broke them." The words landed like a stone, dropped into still water ripples, moving outward, hitting each person at a different moment. David shifted first, just slightly. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. He didn't move to stop the recording either. He watched, head tilted, calculating. Marla didn't blink. She was always the one who smiled through uncomfortable things. Her lips twitched, as if reaching for that familiar reflex, but nothing came. Her face stayed frozen in an almost expression. Not quite denial, not quite fear. The cousins weren't as practiced. One looked down at their lap, awkward, unsure whether to leave. Another fidgeted with the edge of a napkin, eyes darting toward the door. None of them said a word. Because what could they say? On the screen, her father listed names, not just hers, their names too. What they knew, what he'd told them, who was in the room when he gave those instructions, who nodded, who said nothing. His voice didn't accuse. It simply remembered out loud. And memory, spoken clearly, is sometimes the most dangerous weapon. "You were there," he said. "All of you. You heard me say what she was to have. You saw me give her that list." Marla's face flinched. David's fingers curled slowly around the arm of his chair. "She was not a burden," the voice continued. "Not ever. But you made her one out loud, in private, in how you left her out of decisions that involved her life. Nobody looked at her. She sat at the edge of the room, near the door. Her hands rested in her lap, calm. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She wasn't hoping for understanding. This wasn't about change. It was about presence. The simple, undeniable presence of truth in a room where it had been missing for too long. The camcorder screen flickered slightly. "If you're hearing this, then I'm already gone," her father said. "But that doesn't mean I've stopped speaking. I left this because I knew you'd try to rewrite the story." There was no anger in his voice, just disappointment, a kind that reached deeper. "Cedar deserves more than silence." Then the screen went black. For a long time, no one moved. The silence that followed wasn't the awkward kind that appears after a joke falls flat. It was heavier, more permanent, like the kind that follows a verdict. David exhaled through his nose. Not loud. Just once. He stood slowly, as if testing the ground beneath him. Marla remained seated, her arms crossed now, but her posture slightly bent as if the words had pressed her down. They still didn't look at her. She waited anyway, not for attention, for the weight of the silence to settle where it belonged. One by one, the cousins stood. Not abruptly, just enough to mark the moment. They didn't make excuses, didn't offer comfort. They left their drinks, their plates, their roles in the performance they had rehearsed for years. The room had changed, and they didn't know how to exist in it anymore. The camcorder still sat on the table, screen dark, but lid still open. They had all watched the man they thought they controlled speak freely, speak truth. From beyond the grave, he had undone what they assumed was permanent, and now they had to live with what he left behind. The morning after the video played, the house was quiet. Not the usual kind of quiet. This one had an edge to it, like the silence before a storm breaks or the stillness in a courtroom after a witness says something no one expected. The dining table was still set from the night before, plates untouched, a wine glass tipped at an angle, forgotten. The camcorder sat where she left it, lid now closed, as if it too had said enough. She wasn't in the house anymore. She didn't need to be, but David was. He'd barely slept. Pacing through the hallways all night, replaying his father's words, not because he regretted anything regret wasn't in his vocabulary, but because he hadn't planned for this. The tape had exposed just enough to create doubt. Not legal proof, maybe, but enough to shake confidence. enough to make the cousins cancel their weekend plans. Enough to make Marla close her laptop and stare at nothing for 15 minutes straight. She hadn't spoken to him since. He didn't tell her where he was going, but she followed anyway. To the study, their father's favorite room, once filled with old volumes and quiet music. Now stripped of warmth, it felt like a vault, dusty, locked in time, and behind the far bookshelf, bolted into the wall, was a safe. About it in years, but the voice on the tape had mentioned it. There's a letter, their father had said, handwritten. In the safe behind the third shelf, the one with the small nick in the corner, the shelf was still there. So was the nick dot. David stepped forward first, ran his fingers along the grain pulled at the edge. The shelf didn't move, not right away, but a slight push from underneath revealed the hidden latch. A click, a soft shift. The panel opened outward like a door. Behind it, a steel safe, gray, dusty, and locked. Marla moved in now. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, like she was bracing herself against a cold she couldn't see. "Do you know the combination?" she asked. "No," David muttered. They stood in front of it, staring. Their father had kept the code in his head, never wrote it down, never trusted software. If it was written anywhere, it would have been in that notebook she mentioned, one from the first tape, the one they didn't have. David tried a few obvious guesses, birthdays, anniversaries. Nothing worked. The safe remained closed, humming with silence. He slammed his palm against it once, not out of rage, out of frustration. Marla didn't flinch. She just looked at him. "Even if we get it open," she said, "it doesn't mean the letter changes anything." David didn't respond. But he wasn't sure she was right, because if the letter existed handwritten, dated with specific instructions, it could be more damaging than the video. The video was powerful, yes, but it was spoken, emotional, open to interpretation. A letter, though on paper, in ink, in their father's familiar cursive, that could shift everything they didn't call a locksmith. Not yet. That would leave a record. Instead, David sat in the desk chair and opened the old drawers. One by one, searching for any note, any slip of paper, Marla checked behind picture frames, under rugs, between book spines. Nothing. Hours passed. He scribbled combinations on the back of a receipt, testing each one. The safe never clicked. The room grew dim as the afternoon light faded. Neither of them suggested stopping. They just kept searching, quietly, desperately. Because if the letter was real, it meant their father had left behind not just memory, not just confession, but evidence. And if she had the tapes, and they had nothing, then this time, they were the ones left out by the man they thought they understood. They were about to give up. The light outside had dimmed to a dull gray, and the study had fallen into shadow. Marla sat slouched on the window bench, arms limp at her sides, as David leaned over the desk with bloodshot eyes, still flipping through old tax folders and faded phone bills. The safe remained shut, the bookshelf door ajar, and in the air, a growing sense of quiet panic neither of them could name. Then Marla stood up, slowly, as if her body remembered something her mind had buried. "The lamp," she said. David blinked at her. "What?" She moved toward the standing lamp in the corner, the one with the ceramic base and cracked shade. It had been their father's favorite always, tucked behind his reading chair. She reached beneath the rim, fingers fumbling inside the hollow, a soft sound, then a small clink. She pulled her hand back and opened her palm. A key. David was on his feet before she even turned. He took it, still slightly warm from her hand, and moved back to the safe. It wasn't the kind of safe that took keys, at least not on the surface. The dial was still there, stainless and unyielding, but below it, hidden in shadow, was a thin, recessed slot too small to notice unless you were looking for it. He slid the key in. A quiet click echoed in the wooden panels. Then silence. He turned the dial once more. And this time, something gave. A heavy latch released. The safe opened. They both leaned in. Inside was a manila envelope, thick, labeled in block, handwriting that neither had seen since before the funeral, to be opened if contested. David stared at it. Marla reached forward. First, but paused. He opened it. Inside was a letter, folded twice, the paper stiff and old. Below it, a small slip of notary paper, and a signature. He unfolded the letter and began reading aloud, to whom it may concern. It began. This document serves as a final personal statement, intended to be honored in the event of any dispute over the instructions I have given. Stopped reading aloud after that. His eyes scanned the rest silently. Marla leaned closer, whispering. He didn't answer, so she reached for it, took it from his hands, and began reading it herself. It was real. Every detail was there. Dates, specific instructions, mentions of Cedar by name. The lake house was to be placed in her name, not the estate's. The artwork in the attic originals, not reproductions, were hers by intent. The trust account, opened under J.E. Holding, was to be transferred only to her, contingent on her written acknowledgement. It referenced conversations witnessed by someone named Kay Fisher. David frowned. Who the hell is Kay Fisher? Marla didn't. No, either. The notary form was dated for months before their father's final hospitalization, signed by a local registrar. No one had seen it at the funeral. It hadn't been in the official documents the executor had received, and yet tight existed. David folded it back up carefully, not because he cared about preservation, but because he realized what they were holding. This wasn't memory. It wasn't family folklore. It was legally binding. And somehow, it had been buried in the walls of the house they thought they had emptied of all secrets. Behind them, the old study clock ticked once. Then again, Marla sat down slowly, as if her legs might fail her. David remained standing, the envelope in hand, unsure whether he was gripping it out of defense or fear. The letter was real, and if she ever got her hands on it, there would be no turning it back. They had called her delusional, said she imagined promises, claimed there was nothing left to find. But now they were staring at the thing they insisted didn't exist, and it had been waiting, quietly, just like her. The knock on the lawyer's office door came early, before business hours. The receptionist hadn't arrived yet. The lights were still dim in the hallway, soft shadows stretching over the worn carpet and old picture frames. But inside the conference room, she waited patient.com, her chair positioned precisely across from the long table where they had read the will. This time she wasn't alone. Beside her sat a woman in her early 60s, with soft eyes and tired hands. Her clothes were plain. A lavender cardigan over a white blouse. Sensible shoes, no makeup. Just the quiet confidence of someone who had stood at the edge of life and death more times than she could count. Her name was Roberta Lindsley. Most called her Nurse Bobby. When the attorney entered, briefcase in hand, an expression unreadable, he paused for just a moment upon seeing them. She gave a small nod. Not friendly, not antagonistic, just acknowledgement. The lawyer sat down slowly. Before he could speak, she placed the envelope on the table. It was thick, unsealed, no drama. Just a document printed on official paper, signed, dated, and notarized. The attorney opened it. Read the first lines. It was an affidavit, a sworn statement, signed by Roberta Lindsley, attesting to the mental clarity and verbal instructions of her patient, Charles Evan Meriton, the morning of February 8th, 3 months before his passing. The words were plain, clinical, and without embellishment. Nurse Bobby had written, on the above date, I was present in Mr. Merritt's home as part of my daily scheduled care visit. During this time, Mr. Merritt, while fully lucid and unstable, clinician asked me to bear witness to a conversation regarding his estate. He stated the following, clearly and without coercion, that his daughter, Cedar Merritt, was to inherit the lake house property, the J.E. Holding account in full, and the artwork located in the attic. It went on. He expressed concern that these instructions might be disregarded or concealed due to ongoing tensions among family members. He requested I acknowledge this moment, should there be any confusion or contest. I assured him I would. Signed, Roberta Lindsley. RN dated, stamped, notarized by a mobile notary service listed out of Glenhurst County. The lawyer didn't speak at first. He read the document again. Then a third time, his brows furrowed slightly, but he remained silent. Finally, he looked up. Have you spoken to anyone else about this? He asked. She shook her head. Just her, she said, nodding. Toward Cedar. The lawyer tapped the affidavit lightly, then folded it in half. You understand, he said, this will likely trigger a full review of the estate distribution, possibly a petition to reopen probate. Cedar nodded once. I understand, she said. The nurse didn't look rattled. She simply reached into her bag and retrieved a worn notebook, the one she used for medical notes. She laid it flat on the table and turned to a marked page. Her handwriting was neat and small dot there in black ink. February 8th, patient alert, conversational. Expressed specific instructions, re-estate. Stressed importance of daughter Cedar's inclusion, mentioned prior family pressure. The lawyer looked at it for a long time, then leaned back in his chair. Behind him, the walls of the office held framed degrees, awards, photographs with judges and politicians. But at that moment, none of it mattered more than the page in front of him. This wasn't just a memory anymore, this was evidence. Nurse Bobby turned to Cedar and placed her hand gently on her arm. It was a quiet gesture, not of pity, not even of sympathy, just truth, shared between two people who had seen too much go unspoken for too long. When they left, the affidavit remained behind, and for the first time since the will had been read, the silence no longer belonged to the others. The office they met in wasn't grand, no mahogany paneling or skyline views, just a quiet room above a hardware store with peeling linoleum and a humming window. A C unit that never quite won its battle with the summer heat. But when attorney Nyla Quinn walked in, it felt like something shifted anyway. She didn't bother with introductions. Her presence was introduction enough. A dark blazer, low bun, wire-rimmed glasses. She didn't adjust, even once. No attempt to soften the air with small talk. No polite gestures to pretend this wasn't serious. She entered, closed the door quietly behind her, and placed a folder on the table. Cedar sat across from her, calm still, her fingers lightly resting on the arms of her wheelchair. Ask any questions, she just waited. NYLA opened the folder. Page after page, copies, filings, transcriptions, typed statements, scanned originals, a certified copy of the affidavit from Nurse Bobby, a forensic transcript of the video files from the camcorder, a notarized summary of the safe's contents, dated and signed by the locksmith who had eventually been brought in to verify its opening. Then she placed one more folder beside it. This, Nyla said, is the record of irregularities in the probate filing, 7 in total. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The executor, she continued, failed to disclose the existence of handwritten supplemental instructions, failed to mention the safe, failed to produce a proper inventory of sentimental assets under Clause 1 to B, and presented an incomplete witness list during the reading. Cedar didn't speak. Nyla didn't stop. There's also a conflict of interest, she added, tapping a paper with a blunt fingertip. David Merritt appointed himself sole executor without notifying you of your legal right to object. That's a procedural breach under local statute. She sat back slightly now, hands folded. Not in triumph, but in order. I've drafted a motion to challenge the current will's probate. It's ready for filing. Cedar nodded once. Outside the room, the sound of a truck backing up echoed faintly. Inside, the walls felt still. As if they were listening, Nyla didn't ask if Cedar was sure. Instead, she said, "This isn't just about assets." Cedar finally spoke. "I know," Nyla continued, "it's also about precedent. People like him, executors who erase inconvenient family members, assume they'll never be challenged, especially not by someone who doesn't walk into the courtroom the way they do." Cedar met her eyes. "That's why I want you," she said. NYLA single quotes S expression didn't shift. No smile, no warmth, just a quiet acknowledgement. "I'll file. By Monday, that gives them the weekend." Cedar tilted her head slightly. "To do what?" "To prepare," Nyla said. "Because after that, this won't be a family dispute. It'll be a court case, and we'll be entering on equal ground." She gathered the folders slowly, stacked them, tapped the edges even, then slid them into her leather bag. At the door, she paused. "One more thing," she said without turning around. "That camcorder, the original. Keep it locked. Originals matter." Then she left, no handshakes, no promises, just motion. The sound of her footsteps down the stairs felt heavier than they should have. Not aggressive, just steady. Like the slow, deliberate ticking of something that had waited long enough. Cedar sat in the silence that followed, still not smiling, because this wasn't over, it was just beginning. It came up quietly, almost as a throwaway remark, slipped between estate clauses and asset disputes. In one of the legal filings David submitted through the family's retained firm, There was a footnote attached to a justification for Cedar's exclusion from certain portions of the trust. Just a few lines, given the history of mental health complications and cognitive instability. Any prior claims of inheritance may be reasonably dismissed due to concerns over sound decision-making capacity. No diagnosis, no citation, no attached medical document. Just the implication. At first, Cedar hadn't seen it. She wasn't given a copy of the revisions, but Nyla Quinn did. It was on the third page of a supplemental affidavit that had been filed quietly, 2 days after the initial probate hearing. A document meant to discredit without confrontation, relying on the assumption that Cedar wouldn't have access or wouldn't notice. But Nyla noticed everything. She walked into the next meeting with a thinner folder than usual, just one manila file. No dramatic entrance, no announcements. She simply sat down, opened it, and slid a single page across the table to Cedar. It was a psychiatric evaluation. Stamped, signed, official. Cedar blinked. As she read it, the header included the name of Dr. Eliza Noor, a board-certified neuropsychologist and independent evaluator. The evaluation had been completed 6 months prior at the request of Cedar herself. Back when she was applying for independent housing assistance, the examination included cognitive testing, emotional regulation assessments, and an executive functioning scale. The conclusion was clear. No indication of psychiatric instability, no cognitive deficits. Patient is emotionally appropriate, exhibits excellent reasoning skills, and demonstrates full understanding of personal and financial matters. It wasn't just a clearance. It was a full denial of what the trust revision had implied. Cedar looked up. They lied, she said quietly. They tried, Nyla corrected. Nyla pulled out the copy of the estate's supplement affidavit already highlighted. Here, she said, pointing, was designed to suggest incompetence without claiming it directly. If it goes unchallenged, it can be used to frame your testimony as unreliable. Cedar held the paper tighter. They said I was unstable, she murmured. They hoped the word alone would be enough, Nyla replied. That's why we're filing a motion to strike the affidavit and submit this evaluation as evidence. She tapped the doctor's signature at the bottom of the page. I've already contacted Dr. Noor. She's willing to testify. Outside the window, the sounds of traffic moved steadily. Inside, the room seemed stiller than usual, not because of shock, but because of clarity. Cedar had long suspected her siblings would do anything to erase her presence. But seeing it in writing so calculated, so cowardly tightened something in her chest she hadn't noticed before. Nyla packed the folder. I've also pulled communication logs from your care provider, she added. Not one referral for psychiatric intervention. Not one incident. You've never even had a flagged entry in your general health file. She paused, then said flatly, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was strategy. Cedar leaned back in her chair, her hand resting gently on the wheel. Her face didn't show anger, not yet, only recognition. They were preparing for this even before he died, she said. Nyla nodded once. That's how these things work, she said. People don't try to erase you in the moment. They do it slowly. Quietly, they set the groundwork and count on silence. Cedar nodded too, but silence was no longer the plan as Nyla stood to leave. She paused with her hand on the door. They gave you a label, she said, because they were afraid of what you'd do with your name. Then she left, and in the quiet room, Cedar unfolded the evaluation again, not because she needed proof, but because it felt good to hold something that said, in clear and unmistakable terms, that she knew exactly who she was, and now the court would know too. The second tape was different. It wasn't dated, not visibly. No labels scrawled across the cassette this time. Just a faint smudge on the plastic and the faint scratch of age. Cedar had found it in the same box, tucked between a stack of older tapes marked by years, 2003, 2007, 2014. This one was blank. No year, no markings, just dust. She didn't expect much, but she played it anyway. The camcorder screen lit up slowly, flickering as if unsure it wanted to wake. The first few seconds were dark. Someone was fumbling with the device, muffled voices. Then the image stabilized. It was the living room of the estate, the same space where they'd held the estate sale. Familiar furniture, the same wall sconce, that always flickered when the heater kicked in. But the room was younger, less worn. The couch hadn't yet frayed at the edges. The rug was still rich with color. 3 figures stood at the center of the frame. The angle was tilted low, almost as if the camera had been hidden behind something. A bookshelf maybe, or the fireplace mantel. And then the voices began. David first. His tone was sharp, low, the kind of voice used when people think no one else is listening. I'm telling you, if we don't get him to rewrite it now, it's going to be too late. Off to the side, Marla was pacing. She had her arms folded, expression tight. You can't just say that out loud, she hissed. What if he hears you? He's asleep, David snapped. You gave him the pills yourself. Another voice. Entered Elan, the youngest. She wasn't pacing. She was seated in the corner chair, one leg tucked beneath her, arms crossed tightly. He still talks about her, Ellen muttered. Every time I'm in the room with him, he brings her up. How she's strong, how she sees people more clearly, David scoffed. He's just guilty. Doesn't matter, Marla said. If he keeps the trust the way it is, she'll get half the estate. You know that, right? David was already shaking his head. We push the healthcare clause. We tell him she needs support, not property. Frame it as care over cash. And if he changes it back, Ellen asked. We don't let him, David said, flat. Once we revise it and get the legal copy submitted, it'll hold. Everything else can be lost. Marla sat down. Slowly, this feels wrong. There was a pause, then David leaned forward. She wasn't supposed to live this long. Silence, not from the tape, from Cedar. Her hand paused on the camcorder, frozen in place. The image flickered slightly as someone moved in front of the lens. Marla again blocking part of the view, but the audio remained clear. Ellen's voice now quiet, nearly a whisper. You really think she'll just accept it? David, she can't fight it. She's got no lawyer, no record. No one takes her seriously. Marla's voice lowered. We're still her family. She's a complication, David said. Not an heir. And then, without warning, the tape cut off. Static filled the screen. The timestamp blinked once, then froze. Cedar didn't move. The room around her was dark now. She hadn't realized the sun had gone down. The street outside was quiet. A dog barked faintly in the distance, but nothing else stirred. She reached forward and rewound the tape. 5 seconds, David's voice again. She wasn't supposed to live this long. She let it play, then stopped. Rewound it again. She wasn't supposed to live this long. It wasn't just about money. It never had been. They hadn't removed her from the will out of negligence. They had planned it, talked about it, executed it while he was drugged and sleeping. And they did it under the assumption that she wouldn't make it to this moment, but she had. And now, so had the tape. The office lights buzzed softly overhead as Nyla Quinn scrolled through the printouts, flipping each page with care but no hesitation. She didn't look up right away. Cedar sat across the table, waiting, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed. On a single sentence at the top of the first page, it was an email dated 2 months before their father's passing. From David Merritt to attorney Philip Barron, the family's previous estate lawyer. Subject, about the trust revisions, the tone was casual. Far too casual for what followed. Per our last conversation, please proceed with the amended version removing Cedar as named beneficiary. Include language about medical incapacity if possible, or anything that limits her standing to contest. There it was. Clear. Written. Sent.nyla. Looked up now. These were deleted from the family server, she said. But they weren't deleted. From the firm's off-site archive, Attorney Barron's assistant backed up all correspondence for malpractice protection. Cedar didn't blink. Nyack continued, sliding another page forward. This one was from Marla. Same tone, same quiet calculation beneath the surface. If Dad's being difficult, just remind him of the home care bills. He keeps thinking she can manage everything on her own. But we need language in the documents that lets us take that decision away. Another message, another timestamp, and another Ellen days later. Is it done yet? Because I don't want to have to explain to my kids why. Someone who never worked a day in her life is getting the house. Cedar breathed in. Slowly. Nyla tapped the last page. That line right there, that's where we win. Cedar read it again. Getting the house. Nyla explained. They acknowledge your prior standing. They refer to the lake house as yours. That undercuts the non-beneficiary argument entirely. It proves they knew you were included and acted to erase it. Cedar's grip on the edge of the table tightened, just enough to notice. And Attorney Barron retired. But not before his assistant flagged these emails when she was prepping boxers for shredding. She says she felt something was off, but wasn't sure if she should come forward. She's coming forward now, Nyla nodded. She's ready to testify. I've spoken to her twice. We have her notarized statement, and she's willing to appear if we file for a motion of fraud. The silence sat thick between them. These weren't just loose threads anymore. This wasn't speculation or suspicion. It was a paper, trail-timed, dated, written by their own hands. Emails never meant to surface. Emails they thought were deleted. But servers remember, and assistants keep copies. And sometimes the very act of covering tracks is what ends up uncovering everything. Cedar leaned forward. Do we use them now? Nyla shook her head slightly. Not yet. We hold them until the hearing. It's stronger when they're not prepared, when they're still pretending to be shocked. Cedar gave a small nod. She understood the game now. The timing, the value of quiet until it breaks. Nyla packed the pages back into the folder, sealing it with a binder clip. They tried to erase you with words, she said. Now words will bring them down. Outside the window, the hum of passing traffic blurred into a low, constant whisper. Cedar turned her chair slightly, looking out at the world beyond the glass. Not long ago, she would have let this happen in silence. Would have told herself that maybe she hadn't been forgotten, maybe it was just oversight. Maybe it was easier not to push. But this wasn't about comfort anymore. This was about proof, and she had it now. Printed in black and white, waiting in Nyla Quinn's folder like a quiet storm. The draft was folded in thirds, yellowed slightly at the creases. No envelope, no header. Just a clipped stack of pages found wedged between two out-of-print books on his old bookshelf, one about post-war architecture, the other a 1974 guide. To estate tax law, if you weren't looking for anything, you wouldn't have found it. But Cedar was no longer looking, she was confirming. Nyla unfolded the pages slowly, scanning them with a lawyer's eye. No notarization, no official stamps. Just clean black ink on thick white paper. Her father's handwriting wasn't there either, this had been typed. But there, at the bottom, in tight cursive, a signature. It was his, not dated, not witnessed. Not legally binding in the conventional sense, but Nyla didn't toss it aside. Read this, she said quietly, handing the pages to Cedar. She began slowly. The opening language was the same as the official WILFA boilerplate phrasing about being of sound mind, declaring the document a true expression of intent. But everything that followed was different. Gone was the exclusive control granted. To David, as executor, gone was the unequal division of property, and right in the middle, in plain text, was a line that hit like breath in the lungs. To my daughter Cedar Merritt, I leave the lake house in full. She has lived there, tended to it, and been its heart for years. I trust her to decide its future. There was more. An entire section about her artwork, her personal possessions, and a final paragraph. My other children will receive equal shares of the liquid estate, but this home belongs to her. I owe her that truth. Cedar lowered the pages. It's him, she said softly. Nyla already had the camcorder out. The tape had been paused at a moment she hadn't shown anyone yet. She pressed play. It was one of the last recordings, her father, seated at the desk in his study, a little thinner than in the others, his breathing shallower, but his voice was steady. I want Cedar to have the house, the lake house. She's lived there. It's hers. Cedar's eyes didn't blink. I've said it in writing, and I'm saying it here. If anyone pretends otherwise, they're lying. I want her to be protected. Don't make her fight for what's already hers. The wording was nearly exact, phrase by phrase, even the part about the truth and the heart of the home. Nyla paused the tape again. That, she said, is what we call corroborative intention. The courts might not honor an undated draft on its own, but if the author speaks the same words on video, clearly, and without duress, it becomes evidence. Cedar clutched the pages again. NYLA added, we can file for equitable relief based on expressed intent, especially with the attorney's assistant, the nurse affidavit, and this recording. Together, it's not just a draft, it's a suppressed revision. Cedar nodded, her eyes still on the paused screen. She remembered that shirt her father wore in the video, soft gray flannel, a bit too large. It had been his favorite. She remembered the study, the sound of the floor creaking under her wheels, how he would pause to listen when she entered. He hadn't always been perfect. He hadn't always understood her. But this had been real. He had tried. He had written the words. He had spoken them. Twice, maybe more. Even without a stamp or witness, it was as if he had signed it in breath. And now that voice would speak again, not from grief, not from anger, but from record. They hadn't expected her to find this. They hadn't expected anyone to listen. The house next door hadn't changed much over the years. The same cracked driveway, the same faded porch swing that creaked in the wind. The old man who lived there had once been a constant figure in Cedar's childhood, shoveling snow before. Don, bringing over extra tomatoes from his garden in summer, waving without needing a reason. Mr. Rourke, everyone called him. Most assumed he was too old to notice much anymore. They were wrong. It was Nyla who first brought up his name. There was a man listed as a witness on the original sale deed of the lake house. George Rourke, is that him? Cedar nodded. He's lived there for decades. Hard of hearing now, but he used to hear everything. That was enough for NYLA. They visited on a Wednesday afternoon. Rourke opened the door slowly, his posture hunched, his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose, but his eyes were sharp. Alert, Cedar explained who she was, what they were trying to prove. He didn't ask for proof. He just stepped back and waved them in. The inside of his home smelled like wood polish and faded fabric. Family photos lined the mantel. The television was on, low volume, muted captions crawling across the bottom. I remember the day, he said, lowering himself into a recliner. Window was open. It was warm for October. Nyla took out her recorder. You're referring to a conversation between the Merritts. He nodded. Your father was at the kitchen table, Rourke said, gesturing with a trembling hand. He was talking to someone. I heard most of it through my kitchen window. They never fixed the screen, so the sound came through clean. Cedar sat quietly. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, Rourke said. I wasn't trying to snoop, but I heard him clear as day. He said, Cedar gets the house. It's hers. I don't care what they say. I'm rewriting everything this weekend, Nyla. Looked up. He said her name directly. Rourke nodded, twice, said she was the only one who stayed, the only one who didn't want anything from him. There was a pause. I figured you'd already had it settled, he added. Didn't know they'd gone and twisted it all. Nyla asked gently, would you be willing to submit a statement under oath? Rourke didn't hesitate. Write it. I'll sign. Cedar looked up now, her voice small but steady. Why didn't you say anything earlier? He tilted his head toward her. I thought it was obvious you got cheated, he said, but I figured you'd come knocking when the time was right. He smiled faintly. Looks like the time's now. He asked for no compensation, no reward. He didn't seem to care what happened to the others. But when Nyla offered to draft a formal affidavit, he nodded and said, let's make it official. Can't let them bury what he said. They stayed for tea. He poured slowly, hands shaking, but precise. Talked about the sound of hammers when the house was first built. How Cedar used to play with marbles in the driveway. How her father would stop and listen through the window when she played piano, back before her accident. You belonged to that house, he said. He knew it too. The sun dipped lower as they left, casting long shadows across the gravel. Clutched the notes tightly. They had tapes, letters, emails, and now they had memory steady, human, unprompted. A witness with no agenda, just presence. And sometimes, in a case like this, that kind of testimony weighed more than any document because it couldn't be faked and it couldn't be ignored. It started with a phone call late at night. Cedar let it ring the first time, then the second. On the third, she answered. It was David. You don't know what you're doing, he said. No greeting, just the sound of his voice clipped and cornered. You're burning everything down over a house that was never really yours. She said nothing. I spoke to an attorney, he continued. If you keep pushing this, we'll file a defamation suit publicly. Every tape, every page. We'll challenge it all as falsified. You won't survive it. She waited until the silence stretched. Then she said, you're afraid. The line went dead. The next morning, Marla showed up unannounced. She knocked once, then again louder. Cedar rolled to the window, but didn't open the door. "You're humiliating us," Marla called through the glass. "This is going to tear the family apart." Cedar didn't respond. She watched as Marla pulled a folded envelope from her purse and pressed it against the door. "You should read this before your lawyer does." Later, Nyla opened it. Inside were copies of old social services records, an emergency hospital intake form, a psychiatric evaluation from years ago before the accident, back when Cedar was 17. One counselor's note: "Client exhibits extreme withdrawal and possible mood disorder symptoms." "She thinks this will make you look unstable," Nyla said calmly, scanning the papers. "It won't. These are from your adolescence. And none of them contradict the clean bill you were given later. We have that evaluation, signed by 2 physicians." Still, the paper felt heavy in her hands. They weren't just defending themselves now. They were clawing that afternoon. Ellen sent a message through a mutual friend. "Tell her if she doesn't back off, I'll talk to the press. Make sure they know who she really is, who she was before the wheelchair made her inspirational." Sat still. They were shifting their tone, from silent exclusion to visible aggression. They had relied on her silence for so long, they hadn't known what to do once it broke. Now, they were trying to corner her with noise, threats, ghosts from the past. But the difference now was simple. She wasn't alone. Nyla documented every interaction, saved voicemails, photocopied the envelope, and sealed it in evidence. When Cedar asked her what they'd do if the siblings followed through, Nyla said, "Then they open the door wider. They make the court see the full pattern." She paused, then added, "Threats don't scare me. They frame intent." Still, that night, Cedar found herself awake long after the lights dimmed. The voices of her siblings echoed not in anger, but in memory, how they used to shut the door behind them when she asked to play, how they'd laugh when she couldn't keep up, how her father used to tell them, "One day you'll understand what it means to be left behind." They hadn't understood, and now, with everything at stake, they were reaching backward, grasping at versions of her that no longer existed. They didn't know what she had become. They thought the wheelchair was the limit. That quiet meant powerless. That kindness meant compliance. They were wrong. She wasn't building a case anymore. She was revealing one, and their panic was only making it louder. The room wasn't large, just a neutral conference space inside a downtown accessibility center. White walls, folding chairs, a podium with a worn edge. There were no banners, no dramatic music, no flags waving behind Nyla Quinn, her style, and it wasn't Cedar's either. What they brought instead was silence. Controlled, measured, unflinching. A modest email had gone out the day before to 3 local journalists known for covering estate disputes and disability discrimination cases. By noon the next day, nearly a dozen reporters had shown up. Cameras were angled low. Not one boom mic was visible. This wasn't the kind of case that usually made headlines, at least not until the word inheritance was paired with disabled daughter excluded. Nyla stepped to the podium. She wore dark gray slacks, a pressed white blouse, and no jewelry. Her expression remained steady as she opened a file folder and laid out a few sheets of paper. "We will not be answering questions today," she said clearly. "This is a statement only." Out of respect for the late Mr. Merritt and the integrity of this process, she looked up. My client, Cedar Merritt, was the primary caregiver and resident at her father's lake house for over a decade. Despite this, she was excluded from the final reading of his estate, based on a version of his will now under legal challenge. Cameras clicked. NYLA continued. Evidence has emerged, including documented video statements, an undated draft with a Nader's corroborated witness account, and email communication among the other beneficiaries indicating premeditated exclusion. Flipped to another page. These materials suggest not only suppression of intent, but coordinated efforts to discredit and disqualify my client based on her disability status and personal history. A few pens scratched quickly against paper. "This is not a sensational case," Nyla said. "It's a common one. But this time, there's a record, and we are no longer asking to be believed. We are showing the truth." She stepped back. Dramatic pause. No flourish. Just the sound of her shoes against the tile as she returned to Cedar's side. Cedar didn't speak. She didn't need to. She sat in her wheelchair, back straight, her hands clasped together in her lap. She looked not at the cameras, but at Nyla. She nodded once. Outside the building, reporters murmured to each other, already dialing contacts, already chasing angles. By that evening, local news stations ran short segments. Nothing flashy, just a still of the conference room and the caption, "Daughter excluded from will attorney, presents new evidence." The national coverage followed within 48 hours. A morning talk show debated the case briefly during its legal roundtable. A podcast covering disability law reached out for comment. Hashtags began to appear online, slow at first, then circling steadily like wolves, catching the scent of a fresh trail. Inheritance justice, #disabled but not silent, #the will in the tape. Cedar watched the rise of it from a distance. She didn't post. She didn't respond. She wasn't interested in public sympathy. She didn't want to become a symbol, but the attention brought weight. It made her siblings hesitate. It made the attorney who had once ignored her calls suddenly reach out through intermediaries, offering clarification and recollection. It made the story harder to bury, and for the first time, Cedar realized that this was no longer just about the lake house. It was about record, who gets to tell it, who gets erased from it, and what happens when you press play and let silence do the speaking. The courtroom wasn't large, but it was built to feel imposing. Dark walnut benches, pale marble floor, high windows that let in filtered daylight but no warmth. The probate judge, Honorable Marissa K. Doyle, had a reputation that preceded her measured, impartial, intolerant of spectacle. She had presided over dozens of high-profile will contests in the last 10 years, rarely spoke more than necessary. And she listened with an attention that made even the most seasoned attorneys falter mid-sentence. When Cedar and Nyla arrived, the courtroom was already half full. Family members on one side, reporters in the back, and the Merritt siblings lined up like a strained jury. David sat in a gray suit, his expression tight. Marla beside him, arms folded. Ellen, near the aisle, kept glancing at her phone until the bailiff made her put it away. Nyla stood at the front table. Calm, no frills. Her folders were stacked in a clean row. The camcorder sat beside them in plain view. The judge entered. No smile, no small talk. "Let's begin," she said. The opening statements were brief. The family's attorney, a man named Whitaker, argued first. He presented the notarized will, the original copies, and emphasized that any other documentation, especially videos, should be considered hearsay, emotional appeals, or posthumous manipulation. Then Nyla stood. She said nothing of emotion. She spoke only of chronology, of documents, of dates, of the discrepancy between the legal will and the undated draft. She submitted the affidavit from the nurse, the neighbor's sworn statement, and the psychiatric report dated 6 months before the revised will. Then she picked up the camcorder. "Your Honor," she said, "we request permission to present visual testimony by the deceased, dated within 2 weeks of the will's filing." Judge glanced at the opposing counsel. He stood, but didn't object. "Not directly. I will allow it," Judge Doyle said, "provided the material has not been edited." "It has not," Nyla said. "We're prepared to play it in full." The screen was wheeled in standard courtroom equipment, old but functional. A single cord ran from the camcorder to the television. Nyla clicked play, and then the room became silent. Her father's voice filled the space, low and unhurried. The image on the screen showed him seated at his study desk, hands folded, eyes facing the camera. He spoke about his children, about Cedar, about what he feared they might do, about what he had decided to change. There was no music, no edits, just a man speaking into quiet. The judge leaned slightly forward. The first tape ended. Then the second was played, this one more specific. The lake house, the art, the emotional trust he had placed in her, the instructions he'd given the nurse, the words nearly identical to those in the undated draft. The room stayed silent when the third tape began. The tone shifted. Her father looked weaker, breathing harder, but his voice held. "If they try to erase her, I want someone to hear this," he said. Across the courtroom, David looked down. Marla turned pale. Judge Doyle said nothing as the final tape ended. She simply turned to the clerk and requested that it be entered into record. Then she looked at Nyla. "Proceed." There was no visible reaction, no drama, no gavel tapping for order, just the weight of attention. Absolute, deliberate. And in that moment, Cedar realized something quiet and unmistakable. The judge was listening, not out of sympathy, not out of pity, but because truth was being shown, not told. And in that courtroom, under high windows and years of silence, someone was finally letting it speak. The courtroom was so still that even the soft hum of the ceiling fan overhead felt intrusive. No one moved, no one whispered. The final tape had just begun, and every sound in the room gave way to the low, trembling voice of a dying man speaking. From years past, Cedar sat with her eyes fixed on the screen. Her hands rested on the arms of her wheelchair, unmoving. She had seen this recording before, played it alone in the quiet of her room. But here, under the weight of the court's silence, it felt heavier. More real. The screen flickered for a second before resolving into focus. Her father's study again, but this time he wasn't seated. He was lying on the couch, a blanket pulled to his chest, the edges of his face more sunken than before. His breathing was shallow, his voice softer than in the other tapes, but unmistakable. "If you're seeing this," he said, "it means they lied." At the gallery, someone exhaled audibly. The judge raised a hand slightly, not as a reprimand, but a signal to maintain the quiet. The man on the screen continued. "They promised they'd include her. All of them. They told me it would be handled properly, that they'd keep her safe, give her what she's owed. But I knew deep down I knew they wouldn't." His words dragged, spaced between labored breaths, but they were clear. "I watched what they did after the fall, after the chair, how they talked around her, smiled in front of her, and whispered when she wasn't in the room. I didn't stop. I thought, maybe I could fix it with words. I thought maybe if I said it plainly, it would mean something." The video panned slightly, as if the camcorder had shifted under its own weight. The angle revealed more of the cluttered study, old books, half-packed boxes, and the edge of the piano bench Cedar used to sit on as a girl. The judge watched with the same intense stillness. Her pen was down, no notes taken, just focus. "Made copies," he went on, "of everything. I dictated letters. I left the tapes. I trusted the nurse. And if this is playing now, if this tape is actually being heard in court, then you already know they didn't follow through." Lee erased. Her pause. He coughed. Once hard. Then quieter. "But she doesn't need them to give her what's already hers." The screen dimmed for a moment before returning with one final sentence. "She stayed when no one else did." That should have been enough. And then it cut to black. No music, no closing words, just silence. Cedar blinked. She didn't look at her siblings. She didn't need to. The judge exhaled slowly and leaned back. Nyla didn't say a word. She closed the camcorder and returned it to the table. Even she understood that no argument could follow what had just been said. David shifted in his seat. Marla reached for her necklace and twisted it unconsciously. Ellen looked at the floor, and for one long, heavy moment, the entire courtroom simply sat with it. No one broke the silence, because no one dared to. There are moments in legal proceedings that don't require a gavel or a ruling to declare their weight. This was one of them, because nothing speaks louder in a courtroom than a truth that arrives too late to be refuted and lands anyway. The courtroom was quiet again, but not with the same tension as before. This silence had a different tone, thicker, more final. It followed days of testimony, evidence, cross-examinations, and long, steady glances between attorneys. It was the kind of quiet that comes when no one wants to speak before the ruling is given, as if any sound might shift the weight of justice about to land. Cedar sat near the front beside Nyla, her hands resting on her lap, unmoving. She didn't turn to look at her siblings. She hadn't in days. Whatever connection they once shared had dissolved somewhere between the missing clause, the tapes, and the nurse's affidavit. She didn't need to see their faces anymore to know what they were feeling. She could hear it in their stillness. Judge Doyle entered from her chambers with her robe rustling faintly. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked out across the room with the same measured calm that had defined every moment of the hearing. No theatrics, just the law. That was how she had earned her reputation and how she was about to deliver the judgment. She cleared her throat softly. "This court has reviewed all evidence submitted regarding the probate matter of Merritt v. Merritt, et.al., she began, her voice steady. Testimony has been heard from both parties, including witness statements, medical records, email documentation, and recorded materials from the decedent himself. She looked down at her notes, not reading word for it, but guiding her memory. The central question before this court is whether the final will submitted for execution reflects the true and uninfluenced intent of the decedent, Mr. Howard Merritt. David shifted slightly. Marla's arms remained folded tightly across her chest. Ellen stared down at her knees. Judge Doyle continued. This court finds substantial and compelling evidence that the will in question was modified under conditions constituting undue influence. Furthermore, the exclusion of Ms. Cedar Marita, dependent beneficiary, was not only unjustified, but inconsistent with both verbal and written records. Left behind by Mr. Merritt prior to his passing, a sharp breath was heard from somewhere in the back, but the judge didn't look up. The court also recognizes a consistent pattern of behavior among the other beneficiaries, including attempts to discredit the mental competency of Ms. Merritt. Without cause, coordinated concealment of communications, and suppression of known evidence, namely video testimony and a handwritten letter corroborated by a third-party witness. Cedar remained still, her fingers barely tightened. Nyla didn't move. In accordance with California Probate Code, Section 6104, this court rules the will invalid. There was a pause, not for dramatis, a breath before continuing. Mr. Merritt's prior undated draft, while not legally binding, has been sufficiently corroborated through consistent video testimony, witnessed affidavit, and supporting documentation. The court instructs that estate distribution be conducted in line with the draft's directives. Any party seeking to dispute this ruling may file an appeal within the standard 30-day period. Judge Doyle looked up then, directly at Cedar, double quotes Ms. Merritt, she said, her tone unchanged but not unfeeling. This court acknowledges the harm caused by your exclusion. Though legal remedy cannot erase that harm, it can attempt to correct the imbalance. You are hereby reinstated as a beneficiary to the estate of Howard Merritt. No cheers, no tears. Just that Cedar blinked once, slowly. David's lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something urgent. Ellen reached into her purse, likely for tissues. Marla didn't move at all. The gavel was never used. The judge stood and returned to her chambers. It was over, but the silence didn't leave right away. It lingered a moment longer, as if even the air needed time to absorb what had just happened. Cedar finally turned to Ward. Nyla, she didn't smile. She just nodded, and for the first time in weeks, the weight pressing on her chest felt like it had. Shifted, not vanished, but moved, because the law had listened, and this time it had spoken back. The official papers arrived by courier, a thick manila envelope sealed in legal tape, bearing the insignia of the probate court and signed with the judge's own pen. Cedar didn't open it right away. It sat on her kitchen table beside a chipped mug and a folded quilt, untouched for nearly an hour. She just stared at it, as if the weight of what was inside needed to settle before she allowed it to shift anything else. When she finally did open it, the papers were plain. No drama in the words, just clean legal language, paragraphs numbered, signatures beneath, a modified trust. She read every line slowly, her finger moving across the page to keep rhythm with her breath. The trust was not a full transfer of the estate, not a sweeping handover of land, art, or holdings. It was something more precise, more deliberate. It honored what her father had spoken on camera, what he had listed in his private notes, and what the nurse had confirmed in her affidavit. Cedar Merritt would receive the lake house, the same place where she had fallen, the same place she had stayed. She would also be granted an annual stipend enough to live without fear, to cover her care, and to give her room to breathe. But most significantly, she was granted legal custody of what the court termed the secondary recordings. This referred to the remaining MiniDV tapes found in the attic. The ones no one else had seen yet. That clause had come at Nyla's insistence. Cedar flipped the page. The language was firm. The remaining personal recordings of Howard Merritt are to be placed solely under the stewardship of Ms. Cedar Merritt. No other party shall duplicate, distribute, or access the content without her express written consent. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The tapes, those flickering moments of her father's solitude, confessions, perhaps even regrets, were now hers alone to decide on. Whether to share them, archive them, or let them fade quietly into silence. The court had given her legal standing, but this gave her narrative standing. For a moment, she wondered what might be on those tapes. Maybe more of the same. Maybe names, dates, instructions. Or maybe nothing at all, just her father talking into a room, trying to make sense of what he'd done and failed to do. She didn't reach for the box right away. Instead, she closed the envelope, placed it back on the table, and rolled toward the living room window. Outside, the street was quiet. A breeze moved through the elm trees across the sidewalk. A delivery truck drove by, its tires crunching over last night's scattered leaves. This wasn't a victory in the way others would see it. She hadn't taken everything. She hadn't burned the estate to the ground. She had taken back what was already hers, no more, no less. And perhaps that was the only way it would ever feel right. Her siblings hadn't spoken since the ruling. Not even to contest, whether out of shame, strategy, or stubborn pride, she didn't know. But it didn't matter. The trust was in her name now. So were the tapes. And the lake house, the one place she had never truly left. Even when they tried to erase her from it, was finally hers to lock, open, or rebuild. In the corner of the room, the old box of tapes remained untouched. One was labeled only with a single word, winter. She looked at it for a long time, then turned back toward the window. Not yet, for now. It was enough to know the story was hers to finish. The camcorder clicked softly as it loaded the last tape. The screen flickered, static lining the edges, then settled into an image of her father's study. The lamp on the desk was dimmer than in the other recordings. Outside the window, snow was falling gentle and slow, casting a pale reflection on the glass. He looked tired, more so than before, but his eyes were steady, and this time he didn't sit behind the desk. He sat in the armchair, wrapped in a blanket, as if speaking not to the camera, but directly to her. "If this one's reached you," he began, "then I guess you've already seen the rest. I didn't think I'd make it to this one, but I wanted to say something. Something that doesn't belong in court documents or safe deposit boxes." He looked down, adjusting the edge of the blanket on his lap, then slowly back toward the lens. "I'm proud of you." There was a pause, longer than the ones before. "Not because you fought. People always cheer for the one who fights back, as if that's the only way to prove worth. But you waited. You watched them, let them show who they were, and you didn't let it turn you into them." His voice cracked at the edge of that sentence. Not from emotion, at least, not the kind that shows in tears. It was the weight of knowing time was almost gone, and that this was the last thing he'd ever say that could still reach her. "I was afraid," he said. "Afraid that I'd die before fixing what I broke. I thought I could do it with paper and lawyers. But it turns out, it was never about the will. It was about what I let happen when you were still small. When they rolled you into that hospital, and I signed the forms and said, 'We'll get through this,' while not really knowing who the we was anymore." He shifted in his seat. The frame stayed steady. "I watched you shrink into corners at family dinners. I watched you smile when no one met your eyes. And I told myself you were okay because you didn't complain. But silence isn't strength when it's used to survive people you love." Outside the window, the snow had begun to gather along the sill. The room looked colder now, smaller. "I kept all those tapes," he said, "not just for proof, not just for court, but because I knew one day you'd want to see the difference between what people say publicly and what they leave behind privately." He leaned forward a little then, the camera capturing the soft rustle of his blanket. "You never raised your voice, never tried to win the room, and somehow, even with all that was taken from you, you didn't reach for revenge. You reached for truth." There was a silence, then one not filled by static or movement, just stillness. "I hope you use what I left you how you see fit. Burn it all, share it, lock it away. You don't owe them anything, not an explanation, not even a confrontation. You're not here to carry the weight they dropped." He drew in one slow breath. "I know I failed in ways I didn't admit until too late. But if you're watching this, then maybe not everything got lost." Then, just before the tape ended, he looked directly into the camera, clearer than any moment in all the others. "And maybe, just maybe, you'll know I didn't just see what they did to you. I saw who you chose to be anyway." The screen cut to black. No timestamp, no closing line, just the quiet end of a man who finally saw his Daughter clearly when the world had stopped trying to look.